My name is Susan Edwards, and it's a pleasure to be with you all tonight. And thank you for welcoming us into your home to share a very special evening of colonial history and colonial New England history. It doesn't get any better than that. And I'm very pleased to present our presenter tonight. His name is Dr. Stephen C. Eames, and for over 35 years, Dr. Eames has taught history, and he's focused on the impact of war on both civilians and soldiers. He's also the author of two books, Sacrifice of Self, Nahant and the Civil War, which won numerous awards, and most recently, Rustic Warriors, and Warfare on the New England Frontier, 1689 to 1748. So tonight we're going to hear a little bit about Newbury's role and surrounding communities in that fight and issue. And please join me in welcoming Stephen Eames.
Yes, well, good evening. As indicated, I will be discussing how war was conducted in the early French wars and some of Newbury's contribution to that. Now, first, the time period we're talking about is 1689 to 1748, and it encompassed four wars here in New England. The first was King William's War, which in Europe was called the War of the League of Augsburg. It was also connected to the Glorious Revolution. For those who may know about that, that's when they kicked out James II and William and Mary came to the throne. And William was at war with France, and so he brought his new kingdom into that war. And the next war was Queen Anne's War, which was the War of the Spanish Succession. That was 1702 to 1713. Excuse me, King William's War was 1688 to 1697. The colonists like to name these wars after the reigning monarch, and they were lucky in Queen Anne's War because King William was still on the throne when the war began, but his horse threw him and he broke his neck and he died, and Queen Anne came to the throne so they could have a new name for the war. I'm not sure that that's why it happened, but it worked out well. The next war was Dummer's War, 1722 to 1725. And then King George's War, or in Europe, it was called the War of the Austrian Succession, 1744 to 1748. Now, three of those wars involved England at war with France. The one that did not was Dummer's War. And Dummer's War pitted Massachusetts and New Hampshire against the Eastern Indians, who had been allies of the French, but because England and France were not at war, the French did not help out their former allies. Now, just to understand why we're looking at that period and why I focused on it, is I wanted to see how the English colonies conducted war against a foreign foe, which led me away from the previous wars against internal Indian foes like King Philip's War. And also I wanted to stay away from the last French War, which has a real name problem because King George was still on the throne, because that one was taken over by the English army. They ran it, they fought it. And so I wanted to see how the English colonies handled this without as much direct English involvement. Now, the outer line of English settlements was the frontier, which is an older term. My colleagues prefer to use the term borderlands these days, but it is the outer edge of the English settlements. And the frontier in northern New England changed over those years. But at the end of King William's War, the towns were formally recognized as frontier towns, and they were listed in 1698. So I think it's instructive to sort of understand what we're talking about here. On that list in Maine, they had the towns of Saco, Wells, York, and Kittery. Now, there had been settlements farther east, currently Portland, Pemaquid, but they had all been abandoned during the war. Then you get the New Hampshire towns, Rochester, Dover, Durham, Portsmouth, Exeter, Rye, Hampton. And in Massachusetts, the list had Salisbury, Amesbury, Haverhill, Andover, and so on. I always found it interesting that when whoever drew up Route 495, the northern part of it, drew it right along the frontier line in the 17th century, because all those towns right along 495, that was the frontier line. Now, Newbury was not marked as a frontier town in that list, but it wasn't due to lack of trying. I mean, if Salisbury and Amesbury was the frontier, then Newbury was right behind them. Now, we have to settle some more terminology. We know what the wars are. I hope you're all taking notes. There'll be a quiz at the end. Just kidding about the quiz. Particularly, we have to understand the term militia. The term is often used to describe men performing military operations in colonial times. It is not true. The militia system provided a military structure and administration. That's all. The militia officers in a town who were elected comprised the militia committee, and they were an extension of the provincial government. Now, by law, all men between the ages of 16 to 60 belonged to the militia. All members of the militia had to own a firearm. This was not a privilege, it was a civic responsibility. All militia had to train 4 days a year. In reality, certain members were excused from training: town officials, clergy, students. Even men who had held provincial officer rank were excused from training, which has to make you question how important that training was. The training day allowed the militia committee to update their roles, subtract the old, add the young, examine weapons, etc. Now, there weren't enough firearms to go around. It's easy to pass a law and say everybody has to own a firearm. It's quite another thing to have that actually happen. The population outstripped supply because there was no manufacturing in the colonies. All their weapons had to come from Europe. Now, the towns tried to have spare weapons, which they would rent to those who did not have them. Members of the militia who didn't train but might have a weapon, say a clergyman might have a weapon but didn't train, he could loan or rent out his weapon for the training day or even for active service. Loosely put, the militia served like our selective service today. Our selective service takes the name of all young men in case there is ever a draft. And so they know who they can call up. And that's what the militia did. They kept track of the eligible men for active service. It was never intended to strip every male from a town between the ages of 16 and 60 and send them all off to war. Whenever a man performed active military service, he became a provincial soldier in His Majesty's pay. Active service separated a man from the militia and his community for the duration of his service. And nothing says this better than the orders given to John March. You're going to hear a lot about John March this evening, of Newbury. In orders given to him in 1691, he was, quote, commissioned to take the conduct of the soldiers now raised out of the militia of the Massachusetts colony for their Majesty's service against the French and Indian enemy, unquote. So there you have it. They're raised out of the militia and they are in His Majesty's service. Well, what was that service? How was war conducted? And I want to quickly run over the defensive and offensive approaches taken to war at that time. Defensively, we have patrols, garrison houses, and forts. Patrols were small groups of men patrolling the outside of the frontier line. They often referred to this as, quote, on the backs of towns, unquote. They were looking for signs of enemy raiding parties in the area in order to raise the alarm and or pursue raiders after they attacked. Garrison houses were fortified houses in frontier towns, often owned by militia officers or the minister. Some of them were quite elaborate. Some of them, if you saw them, you'd say that's a fort. They would have a palisade of logs, which is upright logs making a wall, and small huts inside around the palisade. Nearby families were assigned to a garrison and had to take shelter there when the alarm was given. This could result in 50 to 100 people crammed into that garrison house. Early in Queen Anne's War, the Massachusetts government ordered the building of blockhouses along the Massachusetts frontier communities, this time including Newbury in that list. Often provincial soldiers were stationed at these garrison houses. Finally, for defense, they had forts. Forts were built along or beyond the frontier line. They were built along known avenues of invasion, like rivers, or on the coast. They were headquarters for provincial forces. They served as trading posts in time of peace, and they represented the power and the authority of the provincial governments. As for war, they often became a magnet, drawing larger French-led Indian forces to them instead of frontier towns. These forts were attacked instead of the towns to their south. So, defense, patrols, garrison houses, and forts. What about offense? Offense consisted of raids and expeditions. Raids were conducted by both sides. They were small to large groups of men moving through the woods or along the coast to attack enemy targets. For the French and their Indian allies, the targets were frontier towns or those forts I just mentioned. You didn't need a large body to attack a town. There were raiding parties of 20 to 30 men who could slip in, do a lot of damage, and slip away. But you also had raiding parties of several hundred as well. For the English, the targets tended to be the native allies of the French, the Eastern natives in Maine, or French communities in the French Maritimes. And men from Newbury participated in such raids, and John March led a few. More on that later. Finally, we have expeditions. Expeditions were large operations copying European warfare. Generally, an expedition involved numbers of soldiers into the thousands, artillery, and naval forces. France only had one successful expedition against Fort William Henry in Pemaquid, Maine in 1696. Now, they planned and started a couple of others intending to attack Boston and the New England coastline, but they fell apart. For the English, the targets of expeditions were the maritime settlements of Port Royal in Nova Scotia and eventually Louisbourg in Cape Breton Island. And then the ultimate prize, of course, would be New France itself, which meant capturing the city of Quebec. The New England colonies attempted to do these alone on 3 occasions. Port Royal in 1690, Quebec in 1690, and Port Royal again in 1707. They captured Port Royal in 1690, but when it came to staying and holding on to it, nobody would stay, so they sailed away. They failed in the attack on Quebec later that summer, mostly due to a gunpowder shortage. They failed in the attack on Port Royal in 1707. That expedition was commanded by Newbury's John March, and I will talk a lot about that more later on. After 1707, what developed was an Anglo-American partnership. And this is kind of an important point, as you'll see. The partnership was the colonies providing what they could, and the English providing what the colonies could not. So what did colonies provide? They provided provincial soldiers to attack the target. They provided food for everyone, colonists and English. And they provided transport ships to get the soldiers, their provincial soldiers, and the food to the target. What did the English provide? They provided the Royal Navy. The colonies had no navy. They provided muskets and ammunition, particularly gunpowder, which was always problematical. They provided regular soldiers to garrison the target once it was captured. They provided military engineers. These were men who were trained in the mathematics of fort building and artillery fire. I'll talk about them more in a little bit. And finally, the English provided the money to pay for it all. It is this partnership that captured the fortress of Louisbourg in 1745, considered by New Englanders as their greatest victory in those early French wars. By the way, it was this partnership that the Americans had to replace in fighting the English in the War for Independence. All those things I just told you, the English provided because the colonists couldn't. And when they went to war in the War for Independence, they were fighting their former partner. And they had to find a replacement, and that replacement would be France. And France would provide all those things. They'd provide the French Navy, they would provide French soldiers, they would provide muskets and powder, they would provide military engineers and money. Okay, so we have a quick understanding of the types of warfare that went on. And as I said, it wasn't militia that fought, it was provincial soldiers. So the next question is, who were these provincial soldiers? The vast majority of them were volunteers. Some of them were pressed, some were hired, but mostly volunteers. They were single men of established families. They were young men serving with their fathers, bachelors, widowers, young men about to be married or recently married. Now, the incentive for them was pay and possible land grants, which had helped them get independence from their families. For example, land grants were given to the 59 Newbury men who served under John March in that Quebec expedition of 1690. And they were, I have the quote here, in 1739, a township on the westerly side of the Merrimack River, quote, and northerly of and adjoining to Contoocook, unquote, was granted and laid out to the, quote, soldiers in the expedition to Canada, anno 1690, under the command of Captain John March. I grew up, just as a side, I grew up in Gorham, Maine, and Gorham, Maine was originally called Narragansett 7 because it was, the land there was granted to men who had fought in King Philip's War. And King Philip's War was against the Narragansetts, and so these settlements were referred to initially as the Narragansett number 7 or number 4 or whatever. Now, the other men who served were older men in their 40s or even older, with children approaching the age of marriage, and they needed to be provided for. You had to give land to your sons, you had to give dowry and furniture for your daughters, and usually they had teenage sons who could run the farm or business while they were gone. And then you have the down and outers, the marginal men, the men whose names are on the list, but there's absolutely no information about them anywhere in the town records. What is missing? This is interesting. What is missing are middle-aged men, men in their 30s. So you have lots of men who are in their 20s. You have men in their 40s. You don't see a lot in their 30s. These were men with large and young families who could not take the time to go away. Now, some of these men did military service once, others did it more. But one thing they had in common, and the most serious weakness in this system, they would only stay for a short time. They were not professional soldiers. This was not their career. They were farmers, they were fishermen, they were tradesmen. They would do a 3-week raid, no problem. They would volunteer to serve on the frontier for patrols and garrison for a few months. They would volunteer for expeditions for a few months, but certainly not more than a year, preferably less than a year. And it caused real problems. I mentioned Port Royal in 1690. As I indicated, they captured the place, but then no one would stay. They're all looking at each other going, you stay. No, I'm not going to stay. You stay. No, I'm not staying. So they took everything that wasn't nailed down and they sailed back to New England. And what did the French do? They just moved back in. There's an incident with Newbury. In 1689, a company of men from Newbury volunteered to pursue a native raiding party that had attacked Dover, New Hampshire. Now, one thing you have to remember is that New Hampshire was a separate colony from Massachusetts, but the men from Newbury rushed forward to help nonetheless. However, they were kept there by New Hampshire longer than they expected, and they weren't happy about it. So in 1694, New Hampshire once again pleaded with Massachusetts for help, and Newbury wrote a letter to the Massachusetts governor saying that they would not go. First, apparently they had a pretty unfavorable impression of the people of New Hampshire. Not sure if that's true today or not, but I won't get into that. Second, they felt that they had been ill-used by being kept longer than they expected. The third incident, just to back this up, is Louisburg. As I said, greatest victory in the history of New England in these early wars. They captured the fortress in June of 1745, but like Port Royal in 1690, who's going to stay? Massachusetts hoped that England would send regulars to take over, but the English army was not only at war with France, but Bonnie Prince Charlie's rebellion was occurring in Scotland. If you know Scottish history, you know all about that, or perhaps if you're an Outlander fan, you know all about that as well. So the whole provincial army was kept at Louisburg, and by September, there was a near mutiny. This was alleviated by letting married men go home that fall and raising new troops to replace those who had first gone. The following spring, English regulars would show up to garrison Louisburg. So that describes provincial soldiers. What about their officers? And here we get, it's really, I found fascinating. It's so different from the English system. In the English army, officers were from the upper class. And they assured this by selling the ranks. It was called purchase system. They purchased their commissions, and you didn't have to know anything about war or the military or anything. In fact, it was a place to stick second and third sons because the eldest son inherited everything. So what do you do with the second son? What do you do with the third son? You buy him a commission in the army. And sometimes these English regiments would have boys as young as 14 showing up as an officer because the rank had been purchased. And then you would purchase your way up. When a vacancy occurred, you'd sell your rank and then you'd buy the higher rank. This was not the case in New England. In New England, officers rose according to success and ability. To be able to raise soldiers for military service was based on a reputation of success. Nobody's going to enlist. If there's a call for a company, the men always wanted to know who would command. And they would enlist with somebody they knew could bring them back. And this brings us to John March from Newbury, who's an excellent example of what I'm talking about and really digs us into Newbury's participation in these wars. He was one of the many prominent military leaders who learned in the field. He started out these wars as a captain. He would raise to go up to major and eventually lieutenant colonel. And a quick review of his career illustrates many of the points already mentioned. In 1690, in the attack on Quebec, he was a captain in command of a company. We've already seen where the members of his company were eventually compensated with land. And the following year, 1691, he and a Daniel King were commanded to lead a raid. And it's an example of what could go wrong on such a raid. They were ordered to march along the north side of the Merrimack River and then head up along the main coast, quote, in search of the said enemy, French or Indians, unquote. As they marched along the north side of the Merrimack, they immediately began to lose men to illness and poor firearms. They left the sick in Greenland, New Hampshire, and picked up a company of men from Hampton, commanded by Captain Samuel Sherburne. When they began to sail out of Portsmouth to head up the main coast, they were fired on by 2 pirate ships. They lost 2 weeks. They were held in Portsmouth to give depositions to the New Hampshire authorities about the, quote, hurly-burly with the privateers, unquote. Finally, they were able to sail to Saco, Maine, and then to what is now Freeport, Maine. They marched inland, they found nothing. They returned to Freeport, and while getting back on their boats, while half of them were on shore, the other half were climbing into the boats, they were surprised by a large force of natives. In the ensuing battle, Samuel Sherburne was killed along with many others. They finally got back on the boats. They kept up the battle, firing from the boats, and they finally sailed back to Portsmouth. As I say, excellent example of how difficult these things could be. March, then we find him in command of Fort William Henry in Pemaquid, Maine. Now, Fort William Henry was built when William Phipps came as governor. It cost 30,000 pounds to build this fort up in Pemaquid. And while March was commander there, he actually brokered a peace treaty between the Eastern Indians and Massachusetts. Now, this turned out to be only a truce. It lasted a year. It was sort of in the middle of King William's War. But it certainly was an accomplishment. It certainly stopped the war for a while up on the frontier. He then asked to be replaced, and his replacement was Pasco Chubb from Andover, Massachusetts. He became the commander. He lost the fort to the French in 1696. Now, before that, Chubb had tricked some chiefs to come in under flag of truce, and he proceeded to kill them. When the French forces arrived a few months later with artillery, ships, and natives, Chubb put up a brave front, but soon found the fort was poorly built, was crumbling, and so he surrendered. And the French tore the fort apart. They leveled it. A fort that I remember it cost 30,000 pounds to build. Chubb was thrown in jail to await court-martial. They left him there for 8 months and then finally released him. And in 1698, after the war was officially over, a native raiding party came to Andover and killed Chubb and his wife, apparently in revenge for his treachery. Now, John March was part of other raids early in Queen Anne's War, and he was also put in command of the New Casco Fort. Now, the New Casco Fort was in what is now Portland, which was tended to be called Casco in those days. And it's kind of curious, this fort never seemed to have a name. It was always referred to as the new fort in Casco or the New Casco Fort. John March was commander and, quote, manager of the trade for the public with the Indians there, unquote. He moved his family and most of his possessions, including cattle, pigs, sheep. He moved it all up there, planted crops. He was settling in. And in 1703, the fort was attacked. It was the beginning of Queen Anne's War, and it was part of an overall assault on all the main towns at the same time, so they could not help each other. It was actually kind of a clever thing that these French-led Indian parties did, was attacking all the main towns at the same time. Now, at the new Casco fort, 3 natives emerged from the woods, apparently unarmed. March walked out to meet them, taking 2 of the oldest men in the fort with him, all unarmed, to talk. I assume the old men were seen as the most dispensable in the garrison. It's not recorded how they felt about it, although they probably volunteered. I have to say, as years go by and I look in the mirror, I find myself identifying more and more with these 2 guys who went out with John March. Because sure enough, the natives had hidden hatchets, killed the 2 old men. But March was a tough guy. He wrestled the hatchet away from one native and held them at bay while armed men ran out to rescue him. The siege lasted 2 or 3 days, and it was lifted by the arrival of the Province Galley, a small warship from Massachusetts. March lost everything in this attack, his stock, his crops, including, quote, as good peas as I ever saw, unquote. He claimed the loss at 500 pounds. Massachusetts gave him 50 pounds as compensation. And then we come now to the command of the Port Royal expedition in 1707. Excuse me. This expedition, as I indicated, was mounted by Massachusetts, although there were 2 small Royal Navy ships that went along as well. The short story is that the expedition arrived at Port Royal, failed to capture the post, returned to Portland, and sent word to the Massachusetts government. The Massachusetts government was not happy. Neither were the people, because the officers that were sent to talk to the government had to walk through jeering crowds when they arrived in Boston. The government ordered March to go back and try again, and sent a 3-man commission to peer over his shoulder while he did it. They went back, they failed again. March fell apart emotionally and turned over the expedition to his second in command. All the blame was heaped on John March, and it was essentially the end of his military career. At least that is the story as it appeared in 19th century histories. Even I was surprised in the history of Newbury by John Currier. The story is more complicated. Remember those military engineers I mentioned earlier? Well, who were they really? As I also mentioned, officers in the British Army generally came from the upper classes. They had to buy their commissions. The lowest rank of ensign often cost 500 to 700 pounds. Now, just to give you an idea of what that is, a common laborer at that time usually made 35 to 40 pounds a year. So you can see how expensive these commissions were. But what if you're from the middle class? You don't have that kind of money, but you feel a career in the military is something you want to do, but you don't want to be a private soldier. One path to being an officer was to go through the engineer service. You went to a special military school. You learned about the math and the angles of fort construction, artillery fire, trajectory. They laid out and planned the building of forts, and when forts were attacked, they told commanders the best positions for the artillery to break down the walls. They were pencil pushers, but extremely important pencil pushers. The British government assigned one military engineer to the North American colonies to assist in fort building and maintenance, and to assist in expeditions. This was not a plum position, especially with Europe at war. Being stuck by yourself in the colonies was not a path to glory and promotion. Captain John Redknapp was the engineer that went with John March to Port Royal. And like all English officers, he viewed provincial soldiers and officers as incompetent and amateur clowns. March arrives at Port Royal. He turns to Redknapp and says, "Okay, tell us where to place the guns." And Redknapp said, "No can do." I'm not sure if that's an exact quote, but it's essentially what happened. In his report to the English government, Redknapp said the ground was too marshy for the artillery, and cited the report of a French deserter that there were 500 men in the fort with food for a year. And deserters are always so reliable in the information they give. Redknapp also wrote in his report, quote, "We have no regular companies in these parts, but militia only, and are very difficulty governed, especially in any action that hazardous," unquote. The colonial officers indicated that Redknapp was negative throughout, recommended that ground not be broken for trench works because their forces were insufficient and disobedient. Provincial soldiers were not, quote, "persons for him to venture his reputation on," unquote. The officers from the Royal Navy ships backed up Redknapp, probably sharing the same opinion about the provincial soldiers. The blame all fell on John March. But really, he had no expertise in waging a siege. Even generals in Europe relied on their engineers to plot cannon angles and proper approach to attack a fort. Redknapp only saw disaster and thought about how it would look on his resume. What was March to do? It was no wonder he had a nervous breakdown. Now, I've gone into some detail here to illustrate that the traditional story about war and provincial soldiers in the colonial period has been oversimplified, with the result that New England soldiers and their war effort has been depicted as amateurish, even incompetent. But the devil is always in the details. And the story is really far more complex, and in that complexity, far more interesting. And now I would love to entertain questions.
Hi, everyone. Steve, that was really quite fascinating. Thank you so much. Gives a lot more context to, these wars that I hear about when I'm researching this, but it's only tangential. So thank you for that context. Hi, everyone. My name is Madison Blass. I am the Executive Assistant, Museum of Old Newbury. I'd like you all to keep your videos off and your speakers muted, but I would love to entertain any questions you have for Dr. Eames. To do so, if you hover your cursor over the bottom of the screen, you will see a chat feature. So if you click on that, you can type in a question and I will read it out loud for Dr. Eames. So we'll start. Claire Mitchell. She starts with, "Great presentation, thank you. You spoke about provincial soldiers. My dad and I, both would-be historians, did a bunch of research on our own family history and was curious. We kept seeing the definition for soldiers, including my own great-grandfather, as volunteers pressed and hired, but not provincial. Is there a difference between these 3 or 4 titles and references? So between volunteers pressed and hired and provincial?"
Yes, well, anybody who served active service was a provincial soldier. Now, the government would determine they needed men to serve on the frontier, they needed men to go on a raid, they needed men to go on an expedition, and they would go to each town and they would say, you have to provide X number of men. So let's just say they go to Newbury and they need to provide 20 men. Generally speaking, you would find that there'd probably be 16 or 17 men who would volunteer. The vast majority, as I said, were volunteers, but you got to find the other 3. Now, they had the capability to press, which in a way is sort of a draft of forcing men to go to war. But in the statutes, you could pay a fine and get out of that if you were pressed. And this is the beauty of the militia system, in that the officers were elected, because it really was a political post. These men made decisions like who was going to be pressed, when people would go into garrison, is somebody's food going to have to be pressed for an expedition or whatever. And so they had to be politically acceptable to the community. But they also knew their community. So what they might do is press a couple of wealthy guys, have them pay their fine, and then use the money to hire a single person to replace them. So you could possibly do, say, if you had 3 more men to get, you could press 6, and you understand that those 6 have the money to pay the fine, and then you go out and you hire somebody. And the hiring was usually the down and outs, the guys, just hanging around, or laborers or whatever. But it was interesting in my research, is that there was a definite distinction between everybody respected the volunteers. Next on the list were the pressed men, because they were considered to be good enough for the militia committee to press and go after. The hired men were actually looked down upon. They weren't good enough to be, they didn't volunteer, they weren't good enough to be pressed, and they had to take this extra money to force them to go out. And often what happened is that, let's say you send a force up to do a raid up in the main frontier, and when they're finished, they want to disperse some of the men to the garrisons up there. Generally speaking, who they would leave would be the pressed and hired men.
Okay.
And the volunteers would go home.
Mm-hmm.
But it also left the least desirable men sitting in those garrisons. And you read complaints all the time about the people in those towns saying, this guy is a jerk. He's lazy. He's, they were deserting all the time. So, as I say, the vast majority of men volunteered for this service, but they still had to fill the numbers, and they did it either by pressing men or by hiring.
Okay. So there really is a social stratus even within the provincial soldiers. All right, so you have some wonderful, fascinating and very interesting comments, but let's see, we'll go to John McKay. Does the NHS have rolls or other records about local men who participated in these actions?
Yes, I mean, you can find lists of companies, in the New Hampshire records and the Massachusetts records and the documentary history of Maine. They are actually quite prevalent. Finding out who these guys are can be sometimes difficult, but they are there. And actually, just as an aside, what got me started on this whole project back in graduate school is I did research on the company from Dover, New Hampshire, who went to Louisburg. And I tried to dig in to see how old they were and how long they had been married and so forth. But I also stumbled on a roll of a company that did a patrol for 3 weeks on the backs of the towns. So I've got one company that went off to Louisburg for 6 months. And I got another company from the same town doing a 3-week patrol. Mm-hmm. And I did the same thing with them. I found out their ages and, whatever. And what really shocked me was, as I indicated, they were the same guys. They were young, they were old. What was missing was the marriage age years of 7 to 18 years married. So you had unmarried guys and you had guys who have been married for just a few years. And then there's like this gap. And then you start to get guys who have been married 18, 19, 20 years in their 40s, and they're going and doing this. And it didn't matter if it was a short amount of time or a long amount of time, it was the same guys doing this or not doing it, as the case may be.
Very interesting.
But
Definitely.
anyway, those roles are there, and you can track with the town records as much as they exist.
Good starting point for further research. All right, so Richard Turner asked, you mentioned many problems managing gunpowder. Can you give some examples about poor management?
Well, it wasn't. It's so much of management is access. This stuff wasn't made in the colonies. In fact, Massachusetts, for example, had a tariff on all ships that came in to port, trading ships. They had to give a barrel of powder for so many tons of stuff that they were. So there was a tariff of gunpowder on ships coming into port. That took care of the normal needs of the colony. But when a war broke out, you obviously need a lot more gunpowder. What happened in Quebec in 1690 is William Phipps, who commanded the naval force that was going to sail up around down the St. Lawrence, was waiting. They had asked England for extra gunpowder. And they were waiting and they were waiting and they were waiting and they were waiting. And they got to be late August and September. And I think most of you understand that it gets pretty damn cold up in Quebec pretty quick. And so they said, we got to go. We can't wait for the powder anymore. And they got up there and they fired their cannons into the town and ran out of gunpowder. And that was one of the reasons why they had to turn around and come back. I also, I found at the start of Queen Anne's War let me just double check this. Yeah, in October of 1707, the government of New Hampshire sent a request to England for extra gunpowder. So October 1707. It took until the following July for that request to make it over the ocean and arrive at the Board of Trade. And now the Board of Trade, being a big bureaucracy, and we all know them, sort of think of them as a giant motor vehicle office. And they spent months asking people about this request. They asked the military engineer who had served before Redknapp came over, and they asked him, what about this? Why is New Hampshire asking for this gunpowder? He thought they wanted it just that they only needed it for Fort William and Mary in Portsmouth Harbor. And he thought it was way too much gunpowder. So he said, I think they're going to merchandise it. In other words, they're going to get the powder, they're going to sell it. That's what they're going to do. And of course, it's like none of them are stopping to think, well, there's a war on, maybe that's why they need the extra gunpowder. So it went for months, and then in December of 1708, the Board of Trade agrees, and they send it now to the Board of Ordnance. They begin an investigation. They ask all the same people the same questions. And now they finally agree. The Queen in council gives permission for the powder, but now they got to gather it together and they got to wait for a number of ships to go. They can't send a single ship over because the French could capture. That powder arrived in Boston in October of 1709. So it took 2 years after New Hampshire voted to request the powder. It took 2 years for it to arrive in the colonies.
Oh, it's amazing that anything got done.
Well, and this is it. I mean, it's so easy to write these histories and just look at the actions and not dig under the surface and realize the logistical problems.
Yeah, every single
involved in it.
Part of it was difficult.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so we'll move on to Mike said, enjoying the presentation. Can you touch on weapons used by the provincials and where they procured the weapons?
Yes. Early on in, again, we got a spread of time here, 1688 to 1748. Early on, they were using earlier weapons, something that's referred to as an English lock. Some of these systems, I kind of look at the old, it's sort of like they were like the 8-track of, weapons that didn't last very long. The English then went to what was called a dog lock, and the dog was just an extra hook that hung on to the cock of the flintlock. These are all flint weapons. One thing that's interesting is that in the colonies, they moved away from matchlocks a lot quicker than they did in Europe. Matchlocks worked well in Europe because they had formal battles. They lined up everybody in the field and they started shooting at each other. Native Americans didn't fight that way. And the last thing you wanted was to have your match unlit when the attack came. So they were using flint weapons early on. Where did they get them from? They got them from, sometimes they captured them. There, if you capture some Frenchmen or whatever, you got their weapons. They sometimes they were sent by the English government as part of incentive for these expeditions. When that partnership developed, the English government began sending military muskets to give to the colonists. But they were the older muskets. They were the worn out ones. Basically, when they got new muskets for their soldiers, what do you do with the old ones? We can send them to the colonists, and we'll send them there. There was an expedition to Quebec set up in 1709, and New England was told, we're coming. The English said, we're coming. We're going to go attack Quebec. They sent all these muskets, all these old muskets over. They distributed. They had the men in Boston. They had them there drilling and drilling and eating and eating and drilling. And you read about this. Oh, these guys are eating so much food. And it was like in the spring, the English government decided, no, we're not going to do it. They put that notice on a ship that took 3 months to make its way to Boston. Now we're not coming. And the Massachusetts government they were in shock, but one of the things they were in shock about is that all the men were going to walk away with the muskets. And they said, well, we didn't do the expedition. We want those muskets back. They wanted to keep them in store to be given out later on. Even though they're old, beat up muskets, they were muskets, So they would get them from the English government. They use French, they use Fowlers. They did not use rifles. Rifles were not common in New England at all. It's something that the Germans brought into Pennsylvania. And it's kind of, you know that for sure, because at the start of the American Revolution, when riflemen came up from Pennsylvania in 1775, they just amazed the people of Boston in the accuracy of their weapons, because they just had never seen rifles. So the weapons they had were all smoothbores, which there's some advantages. You can use shot in them. You can use round ball. They're a little bit more flexible.
Sure. Susan Storer, she asked, are there any colonial garrison houses still standing?
Yes, there are. I can tell you 3 of them right off the top of my head. There's one in Dover, New Hampshire, they built a structure around it. It's my old brain cells, Woodward Museum. It's out in the back. It's a grand old brick house where the museum is, but out behind it, there is this kind of looks like a pavilion, but it's inside is a garrison house. Another very famous one is the Gilman Garrison in Exeter, New Hampshire. And there's a small one actually in York, Maine. That just, you drive by it and there's a little plaque on it, and people drive by and go, but it's It's an old garrison house. So they are around.
Okay. All right. I'm gonna wrap up soon-ish, but a few more questions here. Bill Quigley. Bill asks, I've read that the New England frontier wars changed the views and attitudes that British American colonists held about the native peoples of the region. Does your research concern or reveal anything about that? About not just colonial native relationships that deteriorated to war, but what we would now call racist views that those wars spawned? Or have you found that the bigotry, even before animosity, became fierce?
Oh, God. All right, I'm going to try to keep this because I could spend another 40 minutes talking about this. In my research, what I found is very typical of war anywhere. War breeds anger. And there are historians who very correctly point out that Europeans were far more violent than natives were. In other words, Europeans raised the level of violence. Natives fought each other long before Europeans came here. It was one of the big weaknesses of natives in general, is that they hated each other as much as they hated the English or the French or whatever. When the settlers came here, they were coming out of the religious wars in Europe. And there's nothing that gets people killing each other than religion. And they were used to this slaughter, and they brought it here. I always loved the moment in the Pequot War down in Connecticut when the war began, and the natives burned all up buildings around the fort at Old Saybrook, and they stopped and they called up and they said, "Do you kill men and women? I mean, do you kill women and children?" Because they had never gone to war. This is all new. What's your ground rules? What do you know? And the response was, "You shall see." And of course they did. The Europeans did. They were very fond of burning Indians inside their villages and so forth. And the natives said, "Okay, well, we can do that too." The problem is, you're an Englishman living on the frontier. You live in Maine, say, or Newbury, and you read about a raid in Salisbury, or there were raids in Newbury too, and you grab your gun and you go out and you come upon your neighbors, or these people that are, the houses are burned and the people are slaughtered. You don't look at that and say, I have to remember that we raised the level of violence in these wars. No, you get a hatred for the people who did that. And so I would say that the prejudice definitely increased because of war, which war tends to do anyway. In between, they could trade with each other, but boy, sometimes it was like, you read about them going like, "Yeah, I'll trade with these guys, but I don't really like them much. I don't like them." That's the short answer. I could give you, in my book, it ends with a great story about these men who at the end of King George's War killed some Indians, and the war was over. And instead of being concerned that the war would break out again because of the actions of these men who were arrested, because the Indians, they signed a treaty saying, "If you kill us, you're going to bring us to court." And so they were going to transport them down to Boston to be tried. And local people on a couple of occasions attempted to rescue them and free them because of that animosity that had built up all those years. They didn't care.
All right. Definitely worth getting into chapters in your book. A lot more to unpack, it sounds like. Let's see. Mike asks, is there any record of the location of blockhouses on this side of the Merrimack?
That I would have to look up. I did read the reference of them being ordered to be built. There are references of people putting bills into the Massachusetts government because they paid to have these blockhouses built. But as far as the locations, I have not had the time to look into that.
Okay. All right, and it looks like our last question is, are there any artifacts in society collections related to military service during this period? What about diaries, letters, provisioning records, or other primary resources from participants?
Well, if you want, yes, there are. The short answer is yes, and those published documents that all of these, Massachusetts did it, and New Hampshire did it, and Maine did it. The documents of the documentary history of Maine, they were done in the 19th century, and it's just kind of an old-fashioned approach and all this stuff. But they published the actual letters and orders and lists. And I was doing research on the start of the communities in New Hampshire in the 1620s and the 1630s. And there were lists in the storehouses, and they had lists of military stuff that the storehouses from the proprietors in England had sent over. It was, for example, it's kind of interesting. They had drums and recorders and hautboys, which is a musical instrument, and they were listed with the military stuff. So they were meant to be used for marching. So anyway, that's a great place to start. Those original documents, some of them may not have been translated or transcribed correctly. I mean, if you really want to know, most of them are available in the state archives.
All right, great, perfect. All right, so I think, we just have some people saying, I believe it's the Woodman Museum that we were.
Yes, Woodman, yeah, I know it began with W.
Perfect. All right, and that is all of our questions. Steve, thank you so much for this. This has been a fascinating talk. And
I hope people enjoyed it. I hope they learned something.
There's a lot to learn. All right, so as we're wrapping up, I do want to remind everyone who's listening that our next program will be on Thursday, March 11th at 7 p.m. And it's by Governor's Academy student Talia Kimowitz. Definitely said that wrong, but she's going to give a program called More Than a Tea Party, Tea's Social and Political Symbolism. So it'll be interesting. And with that, I want to thank all of our listeners tonight. And again, thank you, Dr. Eames. This was wonderful.
Okay.